I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
All right, Lee. Let's do this. It's round 3.
This is number 3 in our 10-part series, 100 Years of Chinese Literature. The greatest writers.
The definitive works from each decade. Definitive writers from each decade.
In the 20th century, right?
Yes.
So,
we thought about going all the way to the present, but 120 doesn't have quite the ring 100 does.
I mean, maybe if the people demand it.
If we have a command performance, we're not going to turn down a curtain call, especially if it involves money, which I'm sure it will. We're rapidly on our way to fame and fortune now that we're starting to promote this a little more.
So, Rob, for the years 1900 to 1909, I chose Wu Jianren, you chose Wang Gowei. From 1910 to 1919, I chose Lu Xun, you chose
Li Dajiao. And I should remind the listener, we also had a mini debate about the greatest mustache in the history of Chinese literature. And early on, we were agreed that belonged to Lu Xun. Scrolling the Chinese Literature Podcast research team pulled up another picture of Li Dajiao, and we had to give the victory to Li Dajiao, who has by far the most impressive mustache from that era.
Today, we will not be having any mustache competitions.
No mustache competitions, no.
We are looking at the 1920s, so the years 1920 to 1929.
And let's set everybody up historically here. So we've got the Qing Dynasty falls.
1911, 1912, depending on
warlords take over.
There's a brief period. Some people say the Republic begins in 1912, but in actuality, it's mostly a period of division for about 15 years, from 1912 to 1925.
The Communist Party comes into being in the early parts of the 1920s.
Yeah, that's July 1921.
Right. And then, but it doesn't thrive for very long because Jiang Jieshi,
that's Chiang
Kai-shek, eventually comes out on top with his military force and becomes the de facto government. He does not like communists.
He says communism is a disease of the heart.
Yes, Lee would agree, but that's for a different podcast. But pushes them out. The Long March will become about, Mao's famous Long March will come about as a result of him purging Shanghai and eventually as many other cities as he can get of communists.
So I don't think we need to go too deep into the history, but it's important to know that there are a lot of moving parts.
Yes.
You have the Republic of China is, during the 1920s, sort of stabilizing, and as a part of that stabilization, communism is pushed to the back burner. It escapes alive, but just barely, to some of the more rural parts of China.
So I think the thing I wanted to get across before we get into our writers here is that this is a period when the flush of excitement from toppling the final dynasty and this sort of thrill of where are we going next has started to fade, and we're starting to recede into some familiar patterns. So you have an emperor figure, which is effectively who Chiang Kai-shek is, right? He's got all the guns. He's got the charisma to make people do what he wants, and that's how it is, right? The emperor.
I think it's probably better to just think of him as a warlord, which is another important figure in Chinese history.
Yeah. So this is a turbulent period. You could argue every decade in the 20th century in China was turbulent. This one particularly, though, because you have this first flush, especially of intellectuals and writers who are participating in what they hoped would be this great reform, are now starting to look around and go, something is awry, something is not working. Either maybe it's us, maybe it's society, I don't know.
The May 4th movement starts in 1919, but it really continues on into the early 1920s, and that is one of the main forces that are driving kind of intellectual history in China at this period. Rob, let's get down to our two writers who are both, I would say, May 4th figures.
Yes.
They both come out of the May 4th movement, but in very different ways.
Very different.
So last time I chose Lu Xun. Rob,
this time I'm choosing Lu Xun.
So Rob, you're saying Lu Xun is more of a 1920s figure.
That is what I'm saying. As I argued last time, Lu Xun is pretty much out of commission for most of 1910 to 1919. He's going from teaching post to teaching post. He's working mostly as a secretary, copying books for part of this time.
Translating.
And that as well. he's burned out on stuff so much that he effectively has to be talked into writing anything again, which is part of the famous preface to his 1921 collection, War Cry, Nahan. Anyway, he does publish 2 epochal stories in that period, but the 1920s...
He publishes 2 very important stories in the year 1918 and 1919.
Right.
Years 1918 and 1919.
But Lu Xun, as the figure we know today, the one who exerts the greatest influence in the culture, is the one in the 1920s. We have the full collection of his early works, Nahan, published in the early 20s, 21, 22, depending on how you're dating it. But the main reason I'm choosing him for this decade is for a couple of things. One, we know Diary of a Madman, The True Story of A.Q. Those are the canonical works.
And those are both published in the 19...
Yes, before 1920.
Before 1920.
Right. But if you read the rest of War Cry, there's an incredible amount of variety. There's what seems to be autobiography, although who actually knows for sure. There is at least one piece that is essentially supernatural, called White Light, my favorite story in the collection, about a guy following this mysterious ball of light. There's obviously Diary of a Madman, things like that. He's all over the map stylistically, very experimental, far more interesting than later sort of commentators grant him. And so, to some extent, then he's all in, right? Literature's going to change the world, and I'm a part of it. Let's do this, right? But he burns out. He keeps trying to secure positions. He's in a very, not even an unhappy marriage. He's in a non-marriage, basically. Has an affair with one of his students. Ends up living with her. In the mid-20s, he begins work on, and eventually publishes in 1927, a work which in an earlier podcast I have called my single favorite work of Chinese literature, which is Wild Grass, Ye Cao. Partly because it's so strange and experimental, very well written as well. It's essentially it's a collection of prose poetry, and I don't even know if I could describe it in a few words because it's all over the map.
It's very trippy.
It's very trippy, extremely trippy. In several cases, there's a speaker dreaming about a speaker dreaming about a speaker, and we don't even know where we are anymore. But all of that...
Wild Grass is an appropriate name for it.
It is.
In a variety of ways.
It is. Well, I mean, it really is, though. Like, things growing up haphazardly, they're not trimmed, who knows where they are, where they're going. And the reason I say that this, for me, is the crucial trajectory for an intellectual, not just in the 20s, but in the 20th century in China, is because Lu Xun can never fully move away from ancient China, the classics. There's even 1 or 2 poems in Wild Grass that are written in a classical meter, right? He can't leave it behind, but he also can't fully embrace it, right? And the same with all sides, with communism, with modern China, with European fiction. He can never fully go in any camp, and so he finds himself trying to commit to something, burning out on it, moving to something else, burning out on that. And Wild Grass, for me, is the ultimate record of a struggle like that. What does it even mean to be Chinese in this era? I don't even know. And that's the answer is not the following things. It's, I don't know. It's hard. It's a contradiction. Is there even such a thing? I don't even have an answer to that. And so you have this revolutionary figure who within 6 years is publishing something that you could never use for any revolution anywhere. So Lee, you've already done your Lu Xun thing. Let's hear who your writer is for the 20s.
My writer is Ding Ling. Ding Ling...
Who, incidentally, I have no problem with as a choice. I went with Lu Xun, but fair enough.
Ding Ling is one of the most important female writers in the 20th century Chinese tradition. She is she's a part of the sort of left-wing writers, and she is a fascinating figure.
Absolutely.
She lives into the 1980s. And
I forgot that. You're right.
She's incredible because in the 1920s, she's writing about... essentially, her question is what happens to Nora? Lu Xun poses the question, what happens to Nora in a Chinese context? Nora
being who?
Nora being, this is the character from Heinrich Ibsen's famous play, The Dollhouse,
right?
Which was translated into Chinese and became a huge very important play in the 1910s, 1920s. And Ding Ling is responding to that. She's pushing back against these male May 4th intellectuals like Lu Xun and asking, what role does gender play in this? So Lu Xun has his famous story called Homecoming, 故乡, or I guess it's translated as My Old Home, oftentimes in English. But in this story, the female figure is kind of without agency. And in Ding Ling stories, Ding Ling sort of writes against the sense that males are the only ones who can be intellectuals. Males are the ones who have agency. Her most famous early story is Sophie's Diary, which is sort of fascinating both for what it says about gender and also the kind of psychology that's going on. It is this, it's a diary of a woman who is trying to decide between two different men. There, you may see some symbolic value, but there's one who's more of a traditional Chinese guy, and then another one who's a Chinese Huaqiao, a Chinese immigrant to Singapore, if I remember correctly, who's come back and is trying to woo her. And she's the main character, Sophie, is deciding between these two, and she's dealing with all of these concepts about gender and about modern life that are coming from the West, and it's just a really fascinating story. I think that's her most influential work. That's really the work. Sophie's Diary is the work that really sets her her trajectory. She turns and she marries a guy, and in the mid 1930s or early 1930s, I believe, he is captured and murdered by the KMT. They were both communist. Ding Ling and her husband were both communist. Ding Ling is also imprisoned for a while by the KMT, but the prison that the imprisonment is actually not that bad. Her freedom is restricted, but she's allowed to read a bunch. She actually revises Miss Sophie's Diary during her imprisonment. Now we're kind of getting into the 1930s, but because it's Ding Ling, I think it's okay. And then she eventually escapes from imprisonment, or she leaves imprisonment, and she travels to Yan'an to be with the communists. She becomes this really fascinating figure. She actually is this leftist, but she's questioning how gender works in the Communist Party. She essentially accuses Mao and other communist leaders of judging women by another standard, whereas men are judged from their political ideas. Women's political ideas in the Communist Party are judged based on who they're sleeping with. After 1942, Ding Ling becomes this very much a cowed figure, a cowed writer. She's kind of pushed around, and she never really sticks up for the ideals that she originally had. She, like I said, lives on into the 1980s, but she's imprisoned in solitary confinement for a while during the Cultural Revolution. Also, she, is sent off. She's exiled essentially to the far north. All of this bad stuff happens to her, and she's still quite defensively protective of the socialist state throughout the rest of her life.
What's is interesting, because both the May 4th movement and then the Communist Party that came after it don't arguably have a lot of space for women. Ding Ling is, let's see, I'm trying to get my names right. I don't want to do something stupid here. Perish the thought.
Too late.
I know. We have other podcasts that demonstrate that the damage is already done. But Ding Ling, so far as I know, is the only woman writer working in the 20s among these other, it was a predominantly boys club, entirely boys club, who's really holding her ground, right?
I I think there may have been a few others.
There may have been a few others,
it's fairly a small.
But she's one of the ones to really contribute something that the men are not. Well, I say that as though the men are doing everything, the women aren't doing anything. They're being selectively. I won't say selectively and consciously edited out, but a lot of Ding Ling's writings demonstrate that. Hang on. There's a perspective that you're missing here for all of your sort of national rhetoric.
I would say that Ding Ling is not only the most persuasive writer who's asking this question about what is the role of women as China tries to modernize. I would also say that she is an author who deserves to not just be read as a women's author. I don't think it's fair to categorize her.
Just saying, hey, we're going to have a gender studies curriculum, let's put in Ding Ling, is not...
Yeah.
You can put Ding Ling in anywhere.
She is one of those writers who can go toe-to-toe with Lu Xun. I don't know if she would come out winning in that, but she deserves to be treated like... I mean, she deserves to be in that panoply of great May
Agreed.
4th
But
writers.
I think the reason that I go with Lu Xun over Ding Ling, and particularly for the work Wild Grass, is because Lu Xun attempts to occupy a lot of different positions at the same time. And largely, I would argue, either fails or believes he fails in all of them. Yetzao is a record of... One of the reasons it's called Wild Grass is because it's a space where anything is allowed to happen, right?
We should point out that Wild Field is actually the sort of like a reference in China to those outside of power.
Right.
So there is the sense that
anyone underprivileged, and unlike a lot of issue writing where the underprivileged or whatever are depicted in this very dogmatic, fairly unidimensional way, Lu Xun pulls way back, and gives you altered states of consciousness, dream sequences, reflections where it seems like he himself is sitting by a window, but maybe it's not actually him. And anyway, it's trippy, like you said earlier. But one of the reasons it is trippy is because if what you're trying to do is describe a perspective where anyone anywhere who simply doesn't know who they are or where they're going has a space, it has to be that way. And the fact that the person who wrote The True Story of A.Q. wrote this. Actually, I say that as though they're totally contradictory, but they're really not in some ways, because although there's been a lot of writing done about the person, the character of A.Q., this sort of buffoonish village idiot character, when you read the story, he's actually quite difficult to pin down. Like, is he the way he is because traditional society has made him that way? Are we supposed to laugh at him? Are we supposed to cry?
I mean, famously, Lu Xun mentioned that he oftentimes had people come up to him and say, "You based the character of A.Q. on me. Why did you do that?" And he just repeatedly said, "No, I based this, I didn't base this on you, but everybody reads A.Q. as an insult to themselves during this period."
And that's one of the reasons why that figure is sort of held up as the sort of the Chinese everyman, right?
Not in a good way.
Not in a good way. But again, it would be easy to write a really black and white, here's this guy who was schooled in the Confucian classics, but he's an idiot, Zhang Pu's story, Flowers in a Sea of Sin, Retribution, Hai Hua, has a character kind of like that. This Chinese scholar who's sent as and not really an ambassador, a diplomat, I guess, to Russia. But he lives in his little commentary world and is constantly taken advantage of and pushed around because he doesn't know anything outside his little cubicle, A.Q. is not that. We know very little about him. And then Wild Grass arguably completes the process. It's just, it doesn't even have a protagonist affirmed. There isn't a protagonist. Any protagonist you have is the person actually reading the book, right? And that's an extremely innovative way to go about it. And after that, most of the rest of his writings are what we call zawen, which are sort of like, I guess you can think of them as early blogs.
I think short essay would be...
Well, except that a lot of them don't qualify as essays, or way too short. They're like
You
3
can have a
paragraphs
very
long,
short-
4 paragraphs.
you
But
can
I'm
have a
saying
very
it's
short
Zawin is not Sanwen. There's 2 different terms. Sanwen is sort of thought of as essay. Zawin is sort of like miscellany. Anyway.
Sure.
So yeah, like I say, I have no problem with Ding Ling, but Lu Xun gets my vote for the 20s because this narrative, this biographical period of a scholar going from believing wholeheartedly in the reformative power of literature to literature can't do anything but express how lost we already are, to, hey, let's give socialism a real shot. It's almost schizophrenic, and yet in some ways, if you're really deeply committed to truth in what you're writing and you live an active political life, how else are you supposed to do it, I mean, even Ding Ling, right? She doesn't go all over the map, but you'd have to be crazy to go through what she went through and not have serious problems with the way the Chinese Communist Party functions.
Sure. And eventually she becomes a sort of, I'm going to use the term stooge, for the Communist Party. She writes a very boring, long novel on the collectivization efforts in the north of China. I think it wins second place in the Stalin Prize of 1951, which if you can't even win first place... The
Stalin Prize, then yeah.
If you can't even win first place from the Stalin Prize for literature...
Probably not awesome.
I don't know if it's better or worse to win second place.
That's an example of how you can be a winner and a loser at the same time.
But I think that one of the interesting things about Ding Ling is she took this position on gender, and she was physically quite punished for that. And I think that manifests itself some in the quality of her writing goes down in the 1950s and thereafter. And I think that calls to mind the question of, I think Ding Ling, and we have one other writer in my 100 years of Chinese literature who is a female. And there is this question of, why aren't more women featured? And I think one of the reasons why is because women who took a bold stand in Chinese literature oftentimes were physically and psychologically punished.
Throughout Chinese history.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the reasons it isn't as though there were no female poets. For example, in the Tang Dynasty, they're just not anthologized.
Mostly, yeah.
Mostly. I mean, there's none, but...
Yeah. I mean, Song Dynasty is famous for Li Qingzhao.
Very true.
We should do an episode on.
We absolutely should.
But
when we do our 3,000 years of Chinese literature, year by year, 3,000 podcasts in a row, when we do that thing, we'll get to that.
Yeah. So I think that's a good place to end. So Ding Ling or Lu Xun, Lu Xun is just such a fantastic figure that he can span 2 decades.
Absolutely.
So I'm glad I did it first, and then you did it second. This decade. Ding Ling is one of those figures who we need to know more about.
Agreed.
I think that's a good place to end it.
All right, man.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.